Hi, and welcome back to the DIY SV Polaris channel. Today we're going to be talking about the MPPT controllers and the differences between inexpensive and higher end controllers. In a previous episode, I said I was going to be talking about solar panels and charge controllers, but in an effort to try to keep this a little bit more condensed, I'm just going to go over charge controllers in this episode. Briefly, what is this modern technology called MPPT? In the simplest terms, rather than there just being a MOSFET or a switch turning the panel on and off to the battery as with PWM controllers, through some very clever technology, the controller takes DC power being delivered by the panel, chops it up into AC power, and then passes it through a transformer and converts it back to DC power to deliver current to the battery. And the reason this works so well is because during that change from DC to AC and back to DC, the circuitry inside the controller is constantly varying the load on the panel to deliver its maximum output wattage. This happens several times a second, and because the solar panel's load is variable based off the strength of the sun and how much the solar panel is being shaded, the load must be constantly varied to find at what amperage on the load on the panel side will actually give you the most amperage output on the battery side. Now that you can see the maximum output of each panel can only be attained through varying this load constantly, you can probably see why it's most efficient for each panel to have its own MPPT controller. Each panel seeing a different amount of shading and different amount of light intensity based off of its angle and how it's mounted. Therefore, the maximum output you can extract from a given panel is going to be a situation where each panel has its own individual controller. On land, if you had a big open field and all these panels were seeing similar shading and similar light outputs, it makes sense to wire these in a large series string because you can put more in series on a controller and get more out of that controller depending on the voltage. But on a boat where we're trying to extract the maximum amount of power from our solar panels because of our limited real estate, it makes the most sense to have a controller for each individual panel. So each controller can react specifically to what each panel is seeing. If you wire your solar panels in series to an MPPT controller and even one cell is shaded on one of the panels, it dramatically limits the amount of current that can pass from the solar panel that's having full sun through the one that has a partially shaded cell up to 75–80%. Because of those shading issues and the limited real estate for panels on a boat and our constant issues with shading from the boom, the backstay, and every other thing that's mounted above the solar panels, it starts to make sense to justify having individual MPPT controllers for each individual solar panel. In an ideal world, we would have a controller for each individual panel, and these controllers would be very low cost and effective, but there are differences between low and high-end controllers. And although the low-end controllers can be very reliable, they start to part ways because of their features. And the higher-end controllers, such as Victron, first is the ever-present issue of multi-stage charging with several controllers throughout your boat. When those controllers aren't communicating with each other, so they're in the same phase of charging, and they're not communicating to each other, whatever your absorption phase time limits are with each other, you start to run into difficulties. The Victron solar charge controllers that are Bluetooth enabled communicate with each other directly if set up properly. So they all see what phase of charging each other is in. They coordinate and match up their absorption phase timing so you get more accurate charging. Another thing that makes these charge controllers so effective is the issue of voltage drop amongst the charge controllers. Voltage drop amongst the cabling is a constant issue that affects efficiency and stability. The reason is that the low-cost solar charge controller only sees the battery voltage output at its terminals, and it doesn't compensate for the voltage drop across the wires going into your DC bus and then onto your house bank. Because this cabling could have a half volt of voltage drop along the line, depending on how you size your cabling from your charge controller to your house bank, this can limit the amount of current that the controller is delivering, and it can throw off where the controller is entering its next phase of charging. So you can imagine if you had your solar charge controller bulk voltage set to 14.2, but across the line to the battery, the actual voltage is 13.7. So it enters absorption mode prematurely, and it enters float mode prematurely. And one way to keep this to a minimum is to run the heaviest gauge wire you can as close to the terminals of your controller so the voltage drop is minimal. And that's exactly what I've done on this install that I'll show here. I used some EPEver controllers, but ran a heavy gauge cable to a distribution block right near where the controllers are at, so the voltage drop is 0.1 volts or 100 millivolts. But Victron has solved this issue in a very clever way by allowing their solar chargers not only to communicate with each other about what stage of charging they're in and their absorption settings, but they also communicate with a Bluetooth-enabled Victron battery monitor that's communicating back to them what the actual battery terminal voltage is. So not only are they all keeping in sync and communicating, what their phases of charging are, they're actually seeing what the terminal voltage is so they can compensate with that voltage drop throughout the system. And even if your setup doesn't include a Victron battery monitor to communicate that information back to the solar charge controllers, they sell a little $40 Bluetooth device that you can just basically attach straight to your house bank, and you can put it on the network with your solar charge controllers, and it relays just the temperature and the terminal voltage of the battery back to the charge controller and stabilize the system, make it more predictable. And there are a myriad of other features of these solar charge controllers that include data logging to show your daily production via the app, the amount of time the controller was in each phase of its charging stage. So you can go back and make more sense about how much power you're producing, is there an issue with an individual panel or its controller, and of course these controllers are compatible with the entire Victron ecosystem. So this information can be displayed on a GX device, so you can, at a quick glance, see what your current total output is. You can also use a smart shunt with third-party solar charge controllers, so you can have an instantaneous output on your on a GX device or on your phone of what your solar charge output is with third-party devices. So that's an option, and that's something I've done with several systems. So that's all I'm going to cover today. If you have any other questions, leave them down in the comments. There are plenty other I guess second tier products. It probably seems like I'm shilling for the blue box cult of Victron, but used to be there was a price disparity between these second tier sorts of charge controllers and Victron systems, but that gap is narrowed over the last few years, and it kind of makes less and less sense to use these second tier products unless you have a lot of room. If you're on land, you're not really concerned. You've got a huge bank. You have equal output amongst your panels to use those sorts of things. But in an environment where we're on a boat and every watt counts, and finding an additional 5% of efficiency, just what you really can find just through, even if you have Victron solar charge controllers, through networking a device that's actually seeing battery terminal voltage. I mean, I guarantee you can find an extra 5% of efficiency there, because the solar charge controller is going to be driving totally different, based on compensating for that voltage drop. So even if you have a large AGM bank, or you have a lithium bank, you're gonna, if there is a disparity of a half a volt between your output terminals of your solar charge controller and the actual house bank, the upper stages of charging are going to be pretty dramatically affected by that disparity. Now, of course, as you're approaching the higher end of charging, the current is going down typically. With lithium, less so. But even so, if you can eke out an extra 5% somewhere over a $40 device and some a couple hours of learning some configuration settings, it makes a whole lot of sense. So I guess that's all I'm going to cover for today. Next week we'll talk about solar panels, different technologies of solar panels, and different ways that they can be wired up, and how shading affects these different and new technologies. And I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching. Oh man, this is brutal.